This is your urgent call to action. We are all called to lead in a world in chaos, crisis, and turmoil. Join a pivotal global movement for change to transform the leadership crisis worldwide. Will you play it safe, or will you wake up, step up, and speak out? Like Nelson Mandela did for South Africa and the world, we need a radical new way to think, act, and lead, leading boldly into the future. Join host Anne Pratt, a Harvard Fellow and multi-awarded businesswoman, and unlock the best version of yourself to revolutionize leadership with what the world needs now.
Greetings to all you future bold leaders. Thank you for joining us from around the world. My name is Anne Pratt, formerly from South Africa, and relocated abroad to attend a Harvard Leadership Fellowship in Boston, Massachusetts, in the United States of America. Joining us late at night in the East African country of Kenya is a bold Kenyan national who has traveled to more than 50 countries on 5 continents. She has worked in more than 15 countries in Africa, Europe, and in the USA. She is a super smart Senior McKinsey Associate Partner, frequently interviewed in the media, and is currently shaping Africa's agricultural sector, food security systems, and digital designs to transform the sector. She is a member of the Leadership Council for Harvard University's Center of African Studies, an economist by training, a proud African who is leading initiatives to reimagine the continent. Stay with us as we dig deeper and learn how this proud and powerful woman chose her name, what she did to help a multinational agricultural company break into Africa's billionaire club, and how she asserted her own moral courage within McKinsey to redefine the operating system of the company. We also listened to her Mandela Moment, a moment in a cold Boston winter where she had her own Nelson Mandela mini long walk to freedom. We warmly welcome Amandla Ooko-Ombaka and welcome to Leading Boldly into the Future. So Amandla, I'm super excited to be having this conversation with you today. It's wonderful to have a woman of your caliber and ilk and passion. And thank you for joining this conversation.
Thank you so much, Anne, for having me. You're far too kind in your introduction. It's just such a pleasure to be able to speak with you today.
I thought a great place to start. I was struck by your name, Amandla, and obviously the name has great significance in South Africa, meaning power. And I just wondered what was the significance of that name. And often they say we act out and become the name we are given or the name we choose for ourselves. So I was curious, tell us about the name.
So I always say my parents had no expectation for what I was going to do with my life, naming me Amandla. But my father was a freedom fighter in Kenya during Kenya's post-independence struggle to be a multi-party democracy. And I was born around the time the movie Cry Freedom with Denzel Washington came out, talking about Steve Biko's story. And there were so many parallels with his struggle in apartheid with my father's own struggle for a multi-party democracy here in Kenya. And it just resonated, right? The name sort of resonated with my parents. But my mom told me that every time they said, Amandla, in the movie, I kicked. And so I picked my own name. It's a great story, and so I'm sticking with it.
Well, I have a feeling there's a lot of truth in that story, and I think you did pick your own name. And so, just starting with your career, you've had a remarkable career. Obviously, agricultural transformation and, the use of technology and how we transform that sector, but also working with governments, not only in Africa, but internationally and the private sector, and agricultural input and food companies. Perhaps a great starting place, Amandla, would be, in your mind, what is the current space and challenge in terms of the agricultural sector in not only in Africa, but if you share a global perspective, where are we in the world and in Africa in terms of agriculture as a sector?
So, and that's a really big question about the state of agriculture in the world. My answer is going to be oversimplistic to many, but I think the biggest challenge right now in agriculture and agri-food systems, because we're talking much more now about food systems, it's not just about putting produce into the ground or into ponds or, you know, the cattle that we raise. It's all about how it gets to the end consumer and how that influences our health and our nutrition. But for me, the biggest confluence of factors that we're facing acutely in Africa and other places around the world is the issue of food security. There are 100 million people around the world that go to bed hungry every single night. And when you think about that alongside this massive catastrophe of climate change, which is exacerbating weather patterns. It means places where you expect rain, you no longer have rain. Places that you didn't expect or places that were relatively dry now have too much rain. And so in places like Africa, like a lot of other parts of the world, in India, where there's smallholder farming, this is the confluence of these two factors is really, I think, the biggest challenge of our time. The fact that in Africa, more than 70% of people make some sort of living or earn some sort of income from agriculture, but cannot make a dignified living out of agriculture, I think is a travesty of our time. And so I spend a lot of my heart, my passion, my soul in trying to figure out, number one, how can we increase agricultural productivity with what we have in terms of land resources and the current technologies we have, including the digital technologies we're talking about, better seeds, better inputs. How do we get more food out of the ground, number one? And number two, how can we keep doing this for generations to come?
So from a sustainability point of view.
Absolutely, absolutely. Particularly in the face of climate change, that just makes that much, much harder.
Yeah. So that's an interesting intersection. I mean, an intersection in terms of, you know, in addressing the issue of agriculture and agricultural transformation, what do you think the big transformational challenges and opportunities are?
Yeah. So I think when we talk about agricultural transformation, the biggest lever to transform agriculture, right, to make it more productive and more vibrant, is actually moving people off of the farm and creating off-farm jobs that support the agriculture ecosystem. So when you think about who provides farmers with seeds and fertilizer and crop protection, who are the transporters from the farm to retail markets? What does a retail space look like? How can we get people into designing the technologies that we put on farms? That transition into high value jobs around the agriculture value chain is what we mean by agricultural transformation. So number one, in increasing productivity, yields across a lot of African countries are woefully below where they can be. We have fantastic soil, fantastic climate, and we're just not able, farmers are not always able to afford, even if they are willing, improved seeds, which are resistant to pests, which are more hardy when we think about some of the droughts, et cetera, that we talked about, better use of fertilizer and better use of crop protection. So how can we get more out of what we put in the ground, I think is number one on that. Number two is then creating access to markets. In my experience working with smallholder farmers across several countries in Africa, you know, we've been farming since time immemorial. For a lot of farmers, they're not always able to make the investments that they require in order to get better output because there's no guaranteed market. Because my choice as a smallholder farmer is, do I spend money on fertilizer? Or do I spend money on school fees? Oftentimes for boys and not girls, it's a different story. But if those are your choices, you can see why we don't have optimal use of fertilizer. And so making sure that there's guaranteed access to markets and the markets actually operate and work in a sustainable way, I think is a second big thing to drive the agricultural transformation. Then the final thing, I think I've focused a lot on smallholder agriculture systems, which is just a reality across Africa and India and a number of emerging markets. But I think we need to increase production as a whole, right? Increasing production creates jobs. It's jobs in agro-processing factories for people. It's jobs actually in retail, online commerce, right? It's jobs in export and takeoff. And so making sure that we can still have large scale commercial production, even if it is fed by smallholder farmers and contract mechanisms, et cetera, is also important. So it's those three things that I would focus on.
Well, that's an interesting perspective. I think the other thing that struck me about what you're doing, which is so valuable, Amandla, is this relationship between governments and the private sector. And how do we build these alliances? You know, if I think back to some of the older models, you know, farmers historically have been incredibly subsidized by governments. And so what are the current challenges for this partnership between government and private sector?
I don't think there's any progressive agriculture system in the world that doesn't subsidize farmers, right? I think the cap subsidies you have in Europe are amongst the biggest subsidies given to farmers anywhere, right? Part of the reason why the prices of wheat are so, it's very hard to be competitive in wheat is because of the subsidies we have in Russia and the US. So I think subsidizing agriculture is part of the political economy of how we work. And so the question for me is really, how do we be more efficient with how subsidies are deployed? In fact, in Kenya, I spend a lot of time working with the government here, and the government in the Ministry of Agriculture doesn't like to call them subsidies. They actually prefer the terminology incentives. They're incentives for farmers to increase their production. And there should be a time frame of graduation from the incentive program in place. So the big question for me there is, how do we make it more efficient? So number one, how do you digitize the e-incentive system so that a farmer receives an e-voucher and they can purchase whatever products they want to purchase from whichever provider they'd like to purchase, and then get lots of agro dealers into the system to try and make that work. And I think the role of government there in providing efficiency in the delivery of services to farmers is quite important. But of course, a lot of the service providers, even if you think about digitizing e-incentives, are private sector. In Kenya and a lot of other African countries, right, we're moving to e-wallets on your mobile phone. So who is a telco provider? And you would want the telco provider to be able to provide their services on a commercial basis. Now, there's a bunch of data involved that we're exchanging with the farmer registry. And I think data provides a really interesting nexus for public-private partnerships, because that data in the hands of a telecom provider is many, many millions, sometimes billions, if we think about the whole continent, potential consumers. And so it's really, again, about finding the right incentives for government and the public sector to collaborate. In my experience, the companies across Africa that have been around for 20, 30 years, very large companies, have done well by doing good. So, of course, there's a commercial incentive to operating in these spaces. Eventually, it has to make sense to your shareholders. It has to make sense for you as a financial operator to be running your business. But there's an element of finding the right incentives to work together with government and really offer scale to your business, but more importantly, to touch the lives of millions of Africans with affordable products and services.
What do you think are the big strategic leadership challenges facing the sector, and what is it that those private sector companies can do or are doing that is helping to meet this moment?
Yeah, so when I think about agricultural or companies in the ag sector, there are lots of different types of companies. And I think the challenges they face are all quite different because they're serving different customers and have different inputs. So if you were to think, I'll maybe give two examples, one upstream and one downstream. So if we're talking about upstream, if I think about a large fertilizer, seeds, or crop protection player, I think the biggest challenge there is reducing the cost to serve farmers in the last mile. So, across Africa, it's different in every country, but most countries have between 70 to 90% smallholder farmers, right? And the price of a bag of fertilizer can increase between 30 to 50% just getting from an urban center into the last mile. And so that makes it unaffordable for farmers to purchase and then use as inputs, which leads to all the challenges we talked about before. So I think the biggest challenge there is, how do you effectively serve farmers in the last mile? Because there are hundreds of millions of these farmers. It is a phenomenal business opportunity if you can find a way to reach these farmers and other producers in the ag value chain. So I think that for me is challenge number one. Challenge number two, I think, is then dealing with the fact that Africa is massive, right? 54 different countries, all have different regulations. If you have a new product, you're registering a new seed, you're registering new crop protection, the process of just getting that approved across multiple countries so you can test and tailor and customize to markets, I think, is another big challenge. that I think government actually has a significant role in trying to resolve. Because before the scramble for Africa, we were all chopped up, right? 50% of the borders in Africa are straight lines. We have a lot of similar agroecologies. And so if something can work in Kenya, there are parts of Tanzania it will work in, there are parts of Zambia it will work in. And so just opening up the continent as we think about innovating on these products and services, I think is a big challenge for those upstream players. Every challenge is an opportunity. I think it's really about trying to understand, number one, who do you need to help resolve a challenge? I think the challenges I'm talking about require the government and the private sector and often development partners and foundations to work together. These are really thorny. It's not, a single person solve it. So if it's a challenge, number one, who do you work with to try and resolve it? And then how do you break down the opportunity, right? Africa is diverse. And even within Kenya, we have 7 or 8 different agroecologies. So how do you cut up this opportunity in a way that you can go after it, show results, and then keep going? I think sometimes we try to go too big, too fast. I've seen companies do that. And then it fails. It's like, oh, we can't do business in Africa. No, you probably just started too big, too fast. And so the second part of that opportunity is how you make it small enough that you can wrap your hands around it, but big enough that it's inspirational for you to keep going.
So could you share a specific example where an organization had a very particular challenge? Take us back in time. What was that challenge? What was their light bulb moment, and how did they pivot out of that?
So I'll share an example of seeds. I spent a lot of time in seeds and fertilizer. That's where all my examples are from. But it's a multinational that had been operating in Africa or various countries in Africa for about 40 years. And they were really trying to break into the billion-dollar rank of companies. Most people don't know there's over 430, this was as of 2018, billion-dollar companies across Africa. And the vast majority of them are actually local businesses. They're not all multinationals, but this multinational was trying to break into the billion-dollar club, so to speak. And there's really struggling to get the traction, right? I said it's really hard to serve smallholder farmers. And the higher up the value chain you go, so you work with big farmers or you work with big distributors, it takes away some of your margin as a business. Mm-hmm. When we broke down the opportunity for this client, it was very clear that if you're going to be in a place like Nigeria has massive untapped potential for agriculture, in part because it's a very large population, people need to get fed, but the Nigerian economy has been very, very focused on oil for a long time. Yeah. So when we did the analysis, it became very clear that if they wanted to double their revenues across Africa, they had to be in Nigeria in a big way. We were originally only going to help this company spend 6 weeks analyzing Nigeria and then 6 weeks moving on to other countries. We ended up spending the full 12 weeks just getting very granular on what the opportunity in Nigeria looks like. Nigeria is a massive country, right? There's 300 different vernacular and dialect languages spoken in Nigeria. Wow. And so breaking it down into a way that it was sizable, right? And manageable with local partners, which is what you need operating in many markets. Knowing some is 60% of the challenge, right? So we broke that opportunity down and said, okay, number one, focus on these 3 commodities to start with, right? You have a whole portfolio of seeds, a whole portfolio of crop protection, but when we look at what is demanded by agri-dealers, we ran a bunch of surveys. These are the 3 or 4 actual products to start with. Start in these particular regions of the country because we've done a mapping on demand and supply and how much people are willing to pay, and partner with these 3 players in each of these regions. And so we were able to have a very granular sense of what the opportunity was at the end of the day for them.
How did they execute it?
How did it turn out? Yeah. So they're still in Nigeria. They've actually doubled the number of staff they had in Nigeria. The revenues have not quite doubled yet because COVID happened, port delays, elections, and a whole bunch of other factors, which are just par for the course of doing business here. But they're really committed to taking the long-term view in Nigeria. And I think they're actually going to restructure their Africa organization to have a separate head of division for Nigeria and then rest of Africa, which I think is quite a big shift. Most people will do South Africa and the rest of Africa, but they're actually taking a bit of a different approach in how they're planning to structure their organization.
Yeah. So, just taking another step back, I mean, if you have a look at some of the big issues in the world today, Amandla, in your view, what are the kind of 3 big strategic challenges in the world that keep you awake at night, concerned about where the world is going and what do leaders broadly have to do to meet the moment in the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing to me is income inequality, which I think is only growing and exacerbating as a result of COVID. And it breaks my heart that the world has chosen to deal with this issue of vaccinations very differently than if I ruled the world. When I think about what's going to cause, or what is already causing massive social unrest across everywhere in the world, this is not an Africa thing. It's obscene that there are people that can spend $200-300 billion, right? And then you have 100 million people going to bed every night hungry. So that, to me, I think is a massive challenge that we need to address. And different models are going to work for different countries, right? I don't profess to say we all take the same redistribution of income model. That's not at all what I'm saying, but we all need to figure out how every single citizen in our countries, and not just citizens, but people who live within our borders, because there's a ton of refugees around the world who've been displaced not because of any choice of theirs, right? It could be you or me, just the circumstance of the country we're in at that time. But that every single human being living within our borders can have a dignified living, right? I think is challenge number one. I think challenge number two for me, which I think will only worsen inequality, is when I think about this digital wave that we're going through, and maybe we're on the fourth industrial revolution wave, maybe there is a fifth now. I think it's so important to make sure that everybody has access to technology. I think it will only widen the inequality gap and add a massive gap in knowledge and access to knowledge, which I think, again, with so much knowledge being available and knowledge being effectively democratized, people who do not have access to the internet and access to mobile connectivity, I think is another really big challenge about we need to bring down the cost of devices, we need to bring down the cost of data. And with it, I think for me is maybe the third big challenge. I think that having gone through COVID, the rise of social media, the fact that we're still in civil wars across so many parts of the world, I think that we have a mental health crisis on our hands, right? When I talk to people at every single level of the social strata, we are not taking care of our mental health. That's really scary in terms of the level of suicide rates we have in schools, right? People in high school and elementary school, the shootings in America. I think there's the whole world. We all need to take care of our hearts and our souls and our minds. And it's not a frou-frou, bastion of the elite, I think, to do this. Every single person, I think, needs to be able to wake up and go to bed every single night with some level of peace and some level of knowing that they're part of a larger community that can help them. And so that, I think, that third one, I think, is another big thing that we all have to watch out for and watch out for each other on.
It's quite daunting. It sort of also raises thoughts around, how we are currently approaching these problems in the world and the systems that we have. Is there a personal moment in your life where you were dealing with a very particular challenge that was difficult at the time? And what was that moment? And how did you, when did you discover a different way? And how did you manage to shift out of that?
Oh, I feel like every day there are these challenges.
Maybe take us back to one of those days,
Yeah. So I think both on the personal and professional side, I think that being a manager and managing people for the first time is always a really challenging place to be at, because one, there's insecurities about, or let me talk about myself, my insecurities about being able to lead troops to war, because sometimes that's what it feels like when we go to work every day and battle with our laptops. So I was added in a transition period in my career. And part of what I think I've always prided myself on as an individual, and is part of why I chose to work at McKinsey, which I think is a very values-based organization, is the ability to dissent and the ability to bring an independent perspective to every situation. It doesn't matter, if that perspective ends up being wrong, but I think that we owe it to each other to battle it out and put different perspectives on the table when making really big decisions. On this particular project, I was working with an agro-processor, and it was a tough situation, right? It's a private equity owned firm. The operate the business. There's just always a lot of, in situations like this, is a lot of leadership. In this particular situation, I felt like I was being asked to parrot information that this is what the business reports look like. I'd run my own analysis and came to different conclusions, and that just didn't sit right with me. And I remember that it was Saturday morning, the team had worked 2 weeks straight. We'd worked 7 days a week for 2 weeks straight. And I sat there and I wanted to rewrite the whole board meeting presentation because it just was at a place that I didn't feel like was honest to the reality of what we were seeing in the data. But honestly, it was not going to do a service to our client by not bringing this independent perspective. And I sort of thought, well, they made me a manager now. They're all going to regret this when I bring this up. But I had to speak up and say, we're going to go into the meeting with two different perspectives. This is the perspective from my team, and this is the perspective of the management, and let's debate it out in the board meeting. Because if we don't reveal some of these truths that we're seeing, not just in the data, but from our observations, then we're doing everybody a disservice. And so that was a really big reminder to me that a lot of the value of, I think, being a consultant, a lot of the value of having the privilege of having been to a lot of amazing institutions where you're taught to speak up and have a voice. It's really important in those moments when things don't sit right with me. I will always speak up, and I will always, at risk of, potentially losing your job, at risk of losing money, at risk of losing friends, right? I think it's still so important for the truth to be stated.
Yeah, and I think you've touched on an important point, Amandla, because so often, we see it's often not about what people do, but it's about how they do it. So, so apart from the relationship buildings, were there any other takeaways from that in terms of how you were able to get this dissenting message across in a way that the client could hear it and embrace it and be grateful?
Yeah, so I think it's always really helpful to, in a new environment, to spend the first couple of weeks just listening and understanding and observing how an organization works. As a consultant or as a new person into an organization or a new team, I don't think this is unique to consultants alone, because I think in speaking the language of your teammates and speaking the language of the team, it's not just about the words on the page, right? It's about who do you talk to in the organization first, right? If this person hears about it from Jim or from Jane, right, it makes a difference in how the message is received. So learning all the ways an organization works, we had to do that, right? We had to understand the person with the power over the CEO's calendar is not the CEO, it's the CEO's assistant. So making sure that you understand those power dynamics. And of course, I think you treat everybody with respect, but be extra nice. Be extra nice to Isabella, because I think that's how things get scheduled, right? And then, and I think it's about making sure over meal times, people are complex. We all come to work with, depending on how much you work, 8 to 12 hours of life you lived outside of work, where you are actually awake and alert. And so creating opportunities to get to know people, I think, makes it easier to work with people, easier to understand what people's motivations are and what this job or what this role means to them. Because not everyone, it's not that everyone's work is everything, right? There are certain people who they're going through a certain phase in their life, or work is 10% of what they're doing. I think understanding that just allows you to set expectations well, and avoid disappointment on all sides.
Yeah, no, very, very true. And very profound. Just shifting gear a little, moving to a leader that we both know, respect, admire, Nelson Mandela. Is there a particular moment in your life when he really struck a chord with you? Could you take us back in time?
So I guess it's a bit of an odd response to that. So, I was at Harvard actually when Mandela passed away. I was in my first year at HKS. And I just remember feeling a profound sense of sadness. I had not known Mandela personally in any way, shape, or form. I had this incredible name, and of course had read A Long Walk to Freedom, like everybody should. But there was just such a profound sense of sadness, because I think, to me, particularly later on in his life, the concept of what it means to be a statesperson, right, a statesman or woman, I think is something that Mandela really embodied in all my engagement on video, right, and through books. Just a real understanding that you need to connect with a human being in order to make any level of progress, because that's what policy is about, making policy for human beings. And I think sometimes, now when I interact with, high level officials at high level dialogues, I feel like sometimes we've lost that sense, right, of connecting with the individual human and connecting with what their problem is and what their challenge means to them. And I think that Nelson Mandela really exemplified that. And that profound sense of sadness I felt when he passed away was exactly that. I felt like we lost the one model most people could point to and say that he exemplified that. Now, of course, there's a lot of things that people will disagree with about Nelson Mandela, about his personal life, and the cost that being a statesman for South Africa and being a statesman for Africa, the personal cost that had to his family and his family relationships. And, I think we're all complex human beings, but I think that moment when he passed and that sense of sadness I felt was very much around that. I ended up organizing a symbolic long walk to freedom from the Harvard Business School to the Harvard Kennedy School, and organized a number of speeches from people. It was the response. I organized this with a fellow South African who was also a former McKinsey woman, Maria Makbane. And, we put the call out, and easily 100 people wanted to share tributes and share what Mandela had meant to them. The first international award Mandela received was at the Kennedy School, at the Gleitzman Fellowship Award. And so it felt like a really amazing way to come full circle and have all these people feel exactly the same way I felt. And that's probably the most profound moment and experience of Mandela that I remember in recent history, happening well outside of me actually having met him in any capacity as a person. But I felt that very strongly. From the Kennedy School, we lit the candles at the Kennedy School and walked over to the business school. And then in Spangler, that's where we held the event where people spoke and people shared words. And then we lit the candles, and then it maybe took about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours all in. But it was an amazing, just show solidarity across not just the Harvard communities, because we had people from all across Boston who came to participate, and it was incredible.
That's remarkable. And in terms of the diversity, I'm just curious to hear, Amanda, I mean, the kind of diversity, was it intergenerational? Was it?
Oh yeah, intergenerational, multiracial, multidisciplinary. I mean, people like Tim McCarthy, who'd actually met Mandela, spoke about his experience and his experience living in South Africa. There are people who'd never met Mandela, who'd heard about him from their parents, women, men, people of all shapes and sizes. It was winter. And so it was around November. Right? So everyone was all bundled up, but people still came out. I think Mandela touched a lot of people and a lot of people's lives.
I hadn't heard that before. That's a wonderful example of the many tributes that were paid to him around the world. You spoke about Mandela's connection with the human being and meeting people where they are. In your mind, do you think Mandela's leadership is still relevant today? And if so, in what way?
Yeah, I mean, I think as long as we're human, that will still be relevant. And I hope we're not replaced by robots anytime soon. But I think that we have to start with the human. We have to start with the person that we're doing things for. We then have to layer a number of things on top of it, right? We're all unique and special individuals, but like scale is important, right? As a business creating products. I think as policymakers, scale is also important. So then we have to figure out, okay, when you add up all the humans and you make a policy, how do you still make sure that it's relevant and important to an individual? Right? There's an incredible book called Invisible Women. I will remember the author, but she just goes in this book in excruciating detail about when you add up the average, right? The average when car companies are making cars is a man. And so airbags are actually not safe for women because the airbag will hit you in all sorts of places that will do massive damage to your internal organs. When we talk about so I think you need to then ask yourself, when you add everything back up, does it still make sense to the human and the individual at the center of it all? And I think that is going to be relevant as long as we are human in how we interact with people. particularly as we get more remote in our engagements, in part because I think COVID has just accelerated work from home and remote working, which I think for people who can afford to do that and jobs that are structured that way is an amazing thing, right? A lot of flexibility. But I think that becomes even more important when you can't, as a CEO, stand in a town hall and see all 100,000 or, I guess that was the case for Citibank, but if you can't see all 300 people in your organization, right? If we call it that, we need to keep this level of human connection.
And I guess the other question that comes to mind, in your quotes around, being, this person with a public sector heart and a private sector head, what is the challenge and role for private sector leaders to become, Mandela once said that a good head and a good heart are a formidable combination. And so what is the challenge for private sector leaders in bringing head and heart together?
Yeah, so I guess the longest 16 inches to walk is between your head and your heart. I forget who said that, but that always, whenever I feel tension between what my heart is saying and my mind is saying, I always remember that quote. Look, I think in the environment a lot of private sector leaders are operating in, particularly when I think about public markets. So any companies that are listed on public stock exchanges, is that earnings cycles are quarterly. And change takes time. So if you are being held to a quarterly accountability standard, right? The average tenure of a Fortune 500 CEO, I think, was 5 years. A couple of years ago, last time I checked the data. So if you're always dealing in quarters and your timeline is less than 5 years, I think the incentives for private sector leaders are very much to focus on short-term economic gain as the system is structured. And I think it's really about how do you, again, realign those incentives to be much more long-term focused. Of course, delivering shareholder value along the way, like people have to make money, right? This is how businesses operate. It's unfortunately in capitalism, in this capitalist society that we live in. But how can you make sure that there's shared value being created? And when you think about the role of business, I think in driving societal change, it's critical to me because when we think about who's doing the employment, it's a lot of private sector companies doing employment. So we should care about the schools that are in our communities, because the schools that are in our communities are creating the future employees of a company. And so it makes sense, I think, for companies to be invested in the quality of education in their communities, right? We all have to drink water. And so companies should care about dumping waste into sources of water that people go into people's taps to drink, or go into their water to use for sanitation. So I think, if I was to extend this human analogy, right, corporations and companies serve humans. And so I think it's really about trying to make sure that private sector companies are focused on longer term goals and longer term missions. I think a lot of that comes with partnership, because if you're working with government, right, a lot of these things will take time, and that partnership will require a bit of a longer term orientation. And then I think finally, for private sector leaders, this is the hardest thing I think to reverse, but when we're at a place where the top house of an organization can earn 300, 400, thousands of times more than the employee on the front line, that just can't work. That's not a sustainable operating model. And so I think that private sector CEOs really need to think about the level of inequality that's created in their own companies around pay and value in an organization, because I think that's really, really problematic for all manner of reasons I'm happy to get into. But there's no way that the CEO is 300 times smarter or works 300 times harder than the frontline worker who gets up at 3 a.m. to make it to work on time. There's no way.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about that, Amandla, I mean, you're an economist. The economist perspective would be, well, this is about supply and demand. So if there's a certain supply and demand, and that's the price tag that really good CEOs are commanding, isn't that market forces? And shouldn't there be other policies to reshift that balance? Shouldn't there be different taxation policies? Shouldn't there be different? I'm just interested to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, so I guess it is late at night, so my brain is like not quite clicking in all the ways it normally does. But there's Sandel, there's his name, Michael Sandel at Harvard, talks
Yeah.
about the moral limits of markets. I don't think a market mechanism can solve for everything. So demand and supply clearing at a certain price might just mean that that market should not be demand and supply or market based, right? The two examples I always come back to in this book. So we are very okay cutting in line at an amusement park, right? And we'll pay lots of money to be on the fast track. And that's a place where you say there is demand, right, for this. So I'm going to hike the prices of your fast pass entry and then help actually resolve the supply issue on this, right? Yeah. But we have incredible problems doing that with organ donation. I do, morally. It's the same principle. You're saying there's a much more demand for organs than there is supply. So however you can get to the front of the line, like make it happen. No, it doesn't. So I don't think the market mechanism works for everything. And I really think that this productivity, the way we're ascribing value to productivity is really, really skewed, right? Because a bit rambly, there's a fantastic TV show. I don't watch a lot of TV, but when I do, I invest in TLC called Undercover Boss. And so C-suite executives have to go and do frontline jobs. So if you're telling me we're putting a productivity premium on the CEO earning 300 times more, but the CEO could not do the job at the front line that is creating all this money, there's something wrong with how we're measuring productivity. Without getting your food out of the kitchen on time, every time, at the quality that's demanded, the CEO would have zero money to make. So I think we really need to look at when we apply market thinking to certain problems, particularly when they have really big ramifications on society. And then I think we need to relook at how we compensate productivity.
Another whole conversation. Absolutely. It's an interesting one because often, we would get posed those questions as headhunters and, how do you justify that? And, and I suppose the other question is, I have not met many people who would volunteer to have a pay cut or redistribution of their income voluntarily. No. So, if the system isn't being structured and, built to reward that kind of behavior, then how else do you create that systemic change?
I think the history of the world suggests that if people at the top don't make those decisions, then we end up with social unrest and people will come and take it away. Yeah. And so I think it is in all of our best interest to find a way to live better together and not have, class wars sort of being the next frontier of just unrest in our communities and in our environments.
Shifting tack a little, just on a lighter note, some fun, fast facts. What has been one of your favorite books to read, either past or present?
I'm between like 3 or 4 books. That's such a hard question. Okay, I think there is my favorite book of the moment. How about that? I'll give you that. It's a book by Lovey Ajayi, who's a Nigerian-American author, called The Troublemaker's Guide to Creating Trouble. So she has built her career off of saying what she means and making it very plain and clear that she does not tolerate mediocrity. It basically is a hype manual. If you're feeling like you need to stand up and you need to have your voice heard and you need to remind yourself why you are incredible and awesome and deserve to be in certain spaces, she will really hype you up in this book. It's her second book. Her first book was called the I'm Judging You manual. So I'm really enjoying that book at the moment.
So what is, apart from the hyping up and whatever, if you talk about the Troublemaker's Guide, how does she, can you share anything with us about what does she suggest once you get into trouble? Or is there a whole book about preventing the trouble portion of it?
Yeah, it's in the Lewis version of Good Trouble, right? And so one of the techniques she talks about in the book is creating an oriki for yourself. And oriki is a traditional, I want to say Igbo, but people will come after me because there's, like I said, there's 300 different languages spoken in Nigeria, but I think it's an Igbo tradition in Nigeria of presenting yourself in the biggest way possible, right? So she makes you write your own personal oriki, where you use every single exaggerated adjective you could use to describe yourself, and exaggerated in the most wonderful way, right? Just it would take up as much space as you possibly could. How would you describe yourself? And she makes you write that down and says, every time you need to introduce yourself in your head, use your oriki, and it will give you power, spiritual power, I think is where it really came from in the Igbo tradition, to be your fullest self.
So have you used?
Yeah, so I'm working on my oriki. I'm working on it. I'll get back to you on that.
Yeah, please do. I look forward to, if this is the tempered down version, I can't wait to meet the hyped up version. That's wonderful.
Yes.
So another question, what was one, can you share one of your special moments at Harvard?
So Harvard's an amazing place to be, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to have been to Harvard and having been at Yale before that. I will always mention that. The Harvard Kennedy School had launched a fundraising campaign, a giving campaign, in my first year at the Kennedy School, and there was lots of events around launching the campaign. And one of the launch events was actually a conversation called Leaders on Leadership. And the panel included Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, the former president of Liberia, who was also a Kennedy School alumni, Felipe Calderon, former president of Mexico, who was also an HKS alum, Iris Bonet, who was the dean of student affairs at the Kennedy School at the time, and then myself and one other student. And it was such an incredible experience to be able to just think and structure through this conversation, right? If you have half an hour with two former heads of state, what do you ask? And an incredible opportunity to remind myself, like, these people are human beings also, right? And I think it was both humbling and also really, really like gratifying for me to say, I can be on the same, we can sit on the same seats across from each other and have a conversation. And that was a really, really, a really incredible moment for me and my fellow friend, June, who was the head of the Harvard Kennedy School student government at the time. So it was the two of us that moderated that conversation.
That's wonderful. And both of them remarkable leaders. I remember a time when Sir Ellen Johnson Sirleaf came to South Africa and, spoke at the Mandela Foundation. Very, very humble woman and very accessible, very interesting leadership model in terms of her model of leadership for Liberia as well. Yeah. And I guess, the last question, can you share one of your favorite childhood memories?
Oh, that's an easy one. So I am 100% daddy's girl through and through. There's no mistake about that. And I remember my father lost his sight when I was 8 years old as a result of cancer. And I mean, it means I spent a lot of time growing up when my dad couldn't see, and it was never something that occurred to me as anything that made him less than as a human being. And we just kept going about our lives. I still read the paper to him. He still helped me with my homework. It's only now in my adult life, I imagine that must have been a really traumatic experience for him. But he was on the board of Amnesty International, and they had board meetings every so often. I was about 11 years old at this point in time. And my mother was like, I have work to do. I can't be traveling around with my husband as his partner to these meetings. So you can go. I'm like, yes, get to miss school and go on these trips. Yeah. And so I remember one of these meetings was in Rome, and my sister used to play the violin. And so we were looking for a 3/4 size violin for my then 9-year-old sister. And my father trusted me, and I have no sense of direction, none whatsoever. Google Maps is not helpful. My father trusted me to look at the phone book, which at the time was like a grid system.
Yeah.
To look in the phone book for a violin store. Amandla, 11-year-old, leading her father that cannot see onto a bus outside of the hotel. We got to the piazza in Rome. I navigated miraculously to this violin shop. It was siesta, so of course everything was closed. I managed to navigate us to a coffee shop. He had a coffee, I had a gelato, went back to the violin store around 4 p.m. when they opened up again, got this violin, magically navigated back to the piazza to get a bus and go back to the hotel. I mean, there's so many ways we can break down why that was a ridiculous idea. But it's one of my fondest memories of my father, and we just had a great day. And my sister got her violin, and the fact that I had no sense of direction didn't stop him from trusting me to get us where we needed to get to. And I think has been really formative in how I think about leading teams. I think giving people the confidence to achieve things they didn't think was possible is, if I could do that with every single person, every single team I work with, if they can have the feeling I had on that day, that's the greatest gift I could give anyone, right?
That's amazing. That's a wonderful story. And I have to ask you, were there just the two of you in your family, you and your sister?
I also have a brother, and my sister insists my brother and I are the same person. We butt heads a lot. We are both very opinionated people, but I'm the eldest, and then my sister, and then my brother.
Okay, so you have a pecking order advantage then.
No, they just gang up on me when they don't do what they want. But yeah, we're all quite close in age. We're all 2 years apart.
Okay. Well, I have a sense that you could stand your own very well, Amandla, with a name like Amandla and having chosen it yourself. Power to Amandla. It's yeah. So in our final closing thoughts, any final kind of thoughts around leading boldly into the future, solving some of these big challenges in the world?
Maybe let me share two things on my mind. And number one is, I think that my fellow young Africans, we really need to figure out what our sense of identity is in the continent we're building over the next 5, 6, 7 decades. I think that we grew up in a time of the internet and TV and radio. We grew up in a time of relative peace for most countries across the continent. We weren't fighting for our independence like our grandparents were. We weren't fighting for multi-party democracies like our parents were. And so I think the sense of identity and national identity and what that means is one that I think we need to figure out, because I think when we find the human in our fellow Kenyan, in our fellow South African, or Kenyans and South Africans living within our borders, I think then we'll know how to help each other out. And so I think what I've seen from the Arab Spring, what I've seen in the rise of Julius Malema in South Africa, I think these are all related to finding our sense of identity. And I really hope we do, because I think we need it in order to create a vision for future generations of Africans. And maybe the second thing I'll say is a lesson I learned from Ronald Heifetz at the Kennedy School, that we are not leaders, we practice leadership. And so if we ever find ourselves in positions of authority, not to be confused with positions of leadership, it's important for us to keep honing our skills, because practicing leadership is a practice. We need to get better at managing teams, managing deadlines, negotiation. We always need to keep improving ourselves. Delude ourselves of being charismatic is being a leader. And so I would just encourage, again, my fellow peers and contemporaries to really have a development in how we want to grow in our practice of leadership, and really, really practice and humble about it if we're going to make a difference.
Yeah, no, I think that's incredibly powerful. And the whole adaptive leadership model has so many great, pearls of wisdom around how do we think about leadership, and of course, how do we practice it. And I guess just a follow-on question from the identity question, are you talking about an identity? Are you talking about a national identity, or are you talking about a continental identity?
Very much a continental one. I think national identities, like I said, it's kind of weird, right? Until 60, 70 years ago, we didn't have these national identities across the continent as we define them. We had very ethno-regional identities. And so for me, I think it's our identity as an African, in an African context, as a continent.
Well, Amandla, thank you so much. And to a very powerful African woman and a very powerful human being. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. Thank you for your pearls of wisdom. And thank you for the humor. I look forward to engaging.
Thank you for having me, Anne.
Africa is the perfect place to do well and do good. An underestimated continent with 54 countries, 1.4 billion people, a treasure chest of investment opportunities, and a market valued at more than $3.1 trillion US, and an estimated 430 million empty bellies. Amandla Ooko-Ombaka is a woman who inspires me, and she inspires her for Africa. She lives in a world of seeds and fertilizers and agricultural transformation, helping leading corporations enter African markets, an economist with a private sector mind and a public sector heart. A leading multinational in the agricultural sector wanted to break into Africa's billionaires club, owned mainly by Africa. With Amandla's help, they have focused primarily and initially on Nigeria, the second largest economy on the continent, valued at around $1.15 trillion US. And they are transforming the agricultural sector using digital design, leading-edge technology, and building a sustainable business to reach the poorest of the poor in the last rural mile. Listening to the story took me back to Harvard Business School classes on business at the base of the pyramid with American economist Professor Kash Rangan. Prof noted, unlike financial success, there is no clear consensus to define and measure social impact. In this multinational, social impact is being measured, and it's being measured by looking at the increase in living income of the rural poor, by measuring how much food is coming out of the soil, and what is the reliability of rural access to markets. So multinationals can join Africa's billionaire club by doing well and doing good. And agriculture, it is about using digital design and leading edge technology and building a sustainable business that will reach the poorest of the poor in the last rural mile. So until next time, remember that leading boldly is about making thoughtful, clear choices. And bold leadership is about taking bold action, just one small step at a time. One small step for you, but together, a giant step for humanity. So take care and take thoughtful, bold action.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Leading Boldly into the Future. Please find links and connections mentioned in this show in our blog, and never miss an episode by subscribing at anne-pratt.com. That's ANNE-PRATT.com. May these insights from inspiring industry leaders, remarkable disruptors, and courageous champions of change bring forth a brand new you, emboldened, empowered, and ready to inspire hope. Come back soon, share with your friends, sign up on anne-pratt.com and join our movement for change. Why? Because the world needs you to lead boldly too.